I'll be honest, I didn't expect to be here telling this story. If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have laughed at the thought of a marriage falling apart after all we'd been through. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it, and sometimes it takes a slap across the face to wake up and see the truth. It all started with one of those small, seemingly innocent things. I walked into the living room one evening after work, just in time to hear Claire's voice. She was on the phone laughing. That wasn't unusual. She always had a lot of friends, and we'd never been the kind of couple that hovered over each other. But when I asked her who it was, she froze. It was only for a split second, but I caught it. She quickly hung up and said it was just a colleague from work. The look in her eyes, though, it told me there was more to that call than she was letting on. I don't let things like that slide. When something feels off, I pay attention. I don't trust people who can't look me in the eye, especially my own wife. Claire was never the type to hide things from me, at least not until recently. But I've been around long enough to know when people lie, even when they think they're being smooth about it. And something about that phone call just didn't sit right with me. I tried to dismiss it at first. She had a lot on her plate, and I knew work could be stressful. But over the next few weeks, things started to add up. She was spending more time on her phone, locking it when I walked into the room, always texting or taking calls late at night. Her excuse? Just work stuff. But I wasn't buying it anymore. I wasn't about to let her play me for a fool. Not after everything we'd built together. I didn't spend decades working my ass off in a career as an engineer, providing for this family, only to get blindsided by a wife who suddenly couldn't be honest with me. No, I wasn't that guy. If she thought she could get away with something, she was wrong. Now let me give you some context. My name's Robert. I spent 30 years in engineering, working my way up the ladder to a solid retirement. I've always been the type to take life one step at a time, steady and dependable. I'm not the flashy kind of guy, never wanted the attention. I was always the one who held it together when things got tough. My wife, Claire, on the other hand, was the outgoing one, the social butterfly, the one who made friends wherever we went. Together, we seemed like the perfect match, a quiet, hardworking guy and a vivacious, life-loving woman. We had a good life. 2 kids, both grown and doing well. Weekends spent on the boat, vacations to the mountains, and endless nights of barbecues with friends. Life was good. We weren't rich, but we had enough. We were comfortable, and we trusted each other. At least I thought we did. But trust? Trust gets tested when things start to fall apart. And for me, that test started with that damn phone call. The tipping point came on a weekend we'd planned for months. A short trip to the coast. Claire insisted on going out one night to unwind. We'd been through the usual routine, a nice dinner, a few drinks. But as the evening wore on, I noticed how much time she spent texting. And when I asked her what was so important, she gave me one of those fake smiles. Just work stuff, Robert. Stop being paranoid. Now, I'm not stupid. She didn't need to say it twice for me to know there was something more going on. When I saw her texting someone who wasn't family or one of our usual friends, someone new, I didn't like the feeling in my gut. This wasn't a work colleague. The tone in her messages was too intimate. I should have confronted her then and there. But I didn't. I'd always been the kind of guy who believes in waiting for the right moment, letting things unfold naturally. I wasn't about to go flying off the handle without knowing the full story. I needed proof. So I played it cool, let her think I was buying the act. But the next night, things got ugly. We ended up at a local club just outside the resort. A band was playing, and it was a relaxed kind of vibe. I've never been the clubbing type, but I didn't mind. Claire always loved these places, said they made her feel alive. We were dancing, having a good time, until I saw her. With him. The guy wasn't someone I recognized. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. Maybe he was just some guy she knew from the club. But then I saw the way he was leaning in, too close, touching her arm, laughing at things I couldn't hear, while she looked at him like she was enjoying every minute of it. I was no fool. This wasn't just some friendly conversation. She saw me watching them, and her face changed instantly. That's when I knew. The guilt, the panic. But it was too late for her to pretend she wasn't interested. And that's when I realized I wasn't just being paranoid. My wife was flirting with another man. More than flirting, I didn't storm up to her. I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. That wasn't my style. Instead, I stepped back, made my way to the bar, and watched her from a distance. The look on her face when she caught my eye said it all. The guilt was evident, but she wasn't about to come clean, not without me forcing her into it. But I wasn't going to do that. I was going to make her own this. The truth was already there. I didn't need to ask her any questions. I knew exactly what had happened. And I was done. Claire came over a few minutes later, a little too casual. Too calm. She tried to brush it off, talk about how it was nothing. It's just a friend, Robert. Relax. I wasn't buying it. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. In the end, it wasn't just about the cheating. It was about respect, about the trust we'd built, and how easily she had shattered it. I wasn't about to let her get away with it. No, I was going to make her regret it. And that's where this story really begins. I'm not some naive man who lets his wife walk all over him. I spent decades in a demanding engineering job, rose through the ranks with grit and determination. I wasn't one for drama, but I'd earned my place in life through hard work. Family was always my priority, my kids, my wife, the life we built together. But now, Claire was no longer the woman I thought I knew. This wasn't just about a betrayal. It was about everything I had invested in and everything she had taken for granted. I wasn't going to let this go easily. What happened next would make her understand just how much I could lose and just how far I'd go to get it back. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy weight in my chest. Claire was already up, her phone glued to her hand as she stood on the balcony of our hotel room. The breeze from the ocean ruffled her hair, but her body language gave her away. Stiff, tense, as if she were bracing herself for something. She ended the call as soon as she saw me stirring and walked back inside with a forced smile. "Morning, Robert," she said, her voice too chipper. "I was just making sure everything was set for our snorkeling tour today." I nodded, not bothering to respond. My mind was still replaying the previous night. Claire at the club, talking to that man with a familiarity she couldn't explain. I didn't say a word then, and I wasn't going to bring it up now. Not until I knew more. The day went by in a haze. We went on the snorkeling tour as planned, and Claire acted like everything was normal. She pointed out fish, laughed at jokes the guide made, and even took photos of us together. But I wasn't fooled. Her laughter felt hollow, her affection forced. I was watching her every move now. Every text she sent, every time she glanced at her phone, every moment she seemed to drift off into her own thoughts. Later that afternoon, while Claire was in the shower, I decided to do some digging. Her phone was sitting on the nightstand, and for a moment I hesitated. I'd never been the kind of man to invade someone's privacy, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. I picked up the phone, only to find it locked. She'd never used a passcode before, but now she had one. That was strike two. When she came out of the bathroom, I casually asked, "Who were you talking to this morning?" She paused, towel in hand, and gave me that same rehearsed smile. "Oh, just a tour company confirming our plans." "Why?" "No reason," I said, watching her closely. But I could tell she was lying. That evening, we went to a quiet restaurant by the beach. It was one of those places with dim lighting and soft music, the kind of spot where couples held hands across the table. But Claire wasn't interested in holding hands. Her phone was on the table, buzzing every few minutes with messages. She'd glance at the screen, laugh softly to herself, and then quickly put it down when she noticed me watching. "Who keeps texting you?" I asked, unable to hide the edge in my voice. She looked up startled. "Just Amy," she said, naming one of her friends from back home. "She's asking how the trip's going." "Funny," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Last I checked, Amy didn't call you in the middle of the night." Her face paled, and she fumbled for a response. "Robert, you're overthinking things. It's just work stuff and a few friends checking in. You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was. Not with her disappearing acts, her secretive phone calls, and her lies. The turning point came the next day. Claire announced she wanted to go shopping in town. Normally, I would have joined her, but this time, I told her to go alone. She seemed relieved, almost too relieved, as she grabbed her purse and headed out. As soon as she was gone, I started searching. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed answers. Her phone was still locked, but I found her laptop in her bag. I opened it and began going through her emails. Most of them were work-related, but then I found a chain of messages in a folder titled Personal. The emails weren't explicit, but they didn't need to be. They were from a man named Mark, someone she'd never mentioned to me before. The tone was friendly at first, but as I scrolled further, I found messages that were more intimate. References to last night, mentions of meeting up, and one that read, "I can't wait to see you again. You're worth every risk." Every risk. I felt my blood boil. I printed the emails using the hotel's front desk and slipped them into my pocket. Claire had lied to me over and over again. When Claire returned that evening, she was all smiles. She showed me a few trinkets she'd bought and talked about the little cafe she'd found in town. I listened, nodding, waiting for the right moment. After dinner, I asked, "How was your day?" "Good," she said a little too brightly. "It was nice to get some fresh air." "Did you see anyone you know?" I asked, watching her carefully. She hesitated, just for a second. "No, of course not. Why would I?" I pulled the emails out of my pocket and placed them on the table. "Maybe Mark could answer that," I said, my voice low and steady. Her face went pale, and for a moment, she was speechless. "Where did you get those?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. "Does it matter?" I said, standing up. "You've been lying to me, Claire. I know about the phone calls, the texts, the emails. I know everything." She started to cry, but I didn't care. "Robert, I can explain." "Save it," I snapped, cutting her off. "I don't need your excuses. I need the truth. How long has this been going on?" Her silence said it all. That night, I packed my bags. Claire tried to stop me, pleading and crying, but I was done. "You don't get to make me feel like the bad guy here," I told her. "You did this, Claire, not me." As I walked out of the hotel, I felt a strange mix of anger and relief. I didn't know what my next move would be, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Claire had betrayed me, and she was going to face the consequences. It wasn't the first time I'd felt like a fool, but this felt different. I stood in the hotel lobby, staring at the glass doors that led out to the parking lot. My thoughts raced. The ache in my chest was almost unbearable. Claire had betrayed me, no doubt about it. And the worst part? She thought she could get away with it. I remembered the look on her face when she thought I didn't know. That guilty, jittery smile she tried to flash when she walked in, pretending like everything was normal. But nothing was normal anymore. The moment I had seen them, Claire and that bastard, laughing like a couple of teenagers at the bar, I knew. I had to leave right then and there. No way could I stay in that hotel room with her, pretending I didn't know what had been happening. So, I stepped outside, away from the laughter and the clinking glasses, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to give her any more chances. I wasn't going to play the fool anymore. The anger that had been boiling inside me for days finally reached a point where I could feel it radiating off me like steam. I was done being passive, done being the nice guy. Claire had taken advantage of my trust and my love. I wasn't going to hold back. By the time I walked back into the hotel room, Claire was sitting on the bed, her eyes red from crying. She looked like she had been trying to pull herself together, but I could see through the act. I didn't even have to say a word. She knew exactly what was coming. "Robert," she said in a fragile voice, trying to gather her composure. I can explain everything." I stood there, just inside the doorway, staring at her with arms crossed. There was no warmth in my expression, no compassion. It was as if she had ceased to be the woman I married. She was just someone I had to deal with now. "Explain what?" I asked, my voice colder than I ever thought I could sound. "Explain how you've been sleeping with someone else behind my back for months? Or explain how I caught you at the club, acting like a teenager sneaking around behind your husband's back? You can try, Claire, but I've seen enough." Her face dropped, and for a brief second, I saw something in her eyes that made me sick fear. She was scared. Not for me. She was scared for herself. She knew the house of cards she'd built was about to come crashing down. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just mad at her for cheating. I was angry at myself for ever being blind to what had been going on right under my nose. Claire wiped her eyes, sniffling, trying to speak, but I wasn't in the mood for any of her rehearsed lines. "Robert, please," she pleaded, but I wasn't going to let her manipulate me. "Please? Please what, Claire?" I shot back, my voice sharp. "Please don't tell me how sorry you are. Please don't tell me it didn't mean anything. What? Were you just having a little fun while I was back home thinking everything was fine? She looked at me helplessly, as if she wanted to say something that would make it all better. But I wasn't the man she used to know anymore. I wasn't the guy who always gave her the benefit of the doubt. No, this time I wasn't playing that game. How long, Claire? I asked, the question slipping out before I could even stop myself. How long have you been sleeping with him? Her eyes darted around the room, like she was trying to figure out what would be the least damaging answer. After what felt like an eternity, she finally muttered, "A few months. A few months." I repeated, my voice icy. So, while we were planning trips and going through our lives together, you were, what? Having an affair with him? I shook my head, disgust rising like bile in the back of my throat. And you think this is something you can apologize for? You've wrecked everything, Claire. Her face crumpled, and she collapsed into the bed, sobbing uncontrollably. Part of me wanted to feel bad for her, but I knew better. This wasn't about pity. It was about justice. She was going to pay for what she had done. I never meant for it to get this far, she sobbed. It just happened. I didn't think it would hurt you. Of course it hurt me. I snapped. You didn't care, Claire. You never thought about me, about us. Once when you were lying to my face. And that was the moment I knew for sure. I couldn't trust her anymore. She was a stranger to me now, a woman who had betrayed me and thought she could talk her way out of it. The anger inside me settled into something colder, more calculated. This wasn't about confronting her in some dramatic way. No, this was about ensuring that Claire knew exactly what it felt like to be exposed, humiliated, and stripped of all her power. I'd spent years working hard to build a life with Claire, a life that I thought was based on trust and respect. She had taken that for granted. And now it was time for her to see just how easy it was for me to dismantle everything she had built on lies. She thought she could walk away from this unscathed, but I was going to make sure she felt every ounce of the damage she had caused. The first step was making sure her family knew the truth. They needed to know what kind of woman they had been supporting all this time. I grabbed my phone and dialed her sister, Angela. We weren't close, but I didn't care about niceties anymore. It was time for the truth to come out. Angela, I said, my voice tight with anger. It's Robert. We need to talk. Robert? She asked, a note of concern creeping into her voice. What's going on? You sound upset. I'm upset because your sister is a liar, a cheater, and I'm done pretending I don't know about it. She's been having an affair with a man named Mark for months. It's time you knew. There was silence on the other end of the phone. I could almost hear her processing the words, trying to make sense of what I'd just said. And then she spoke, her voice wavering. What? Robert, no? That can't be true. Are you sure? I'm sure, I said firmly. I've seen the texts, the emails. I know everything. She's been hiding it from you all, just like she's been hiding it from me. And I'm not going to let her lie her way out of this anymore. Angela was quiet for a moment. I don't know what to say. This is a lot. What are you going to do? I'm going to expose her. I'm not going to keep pretending everything's fine. And you shouldn't either. Okay, Angela said softly. I'll talk to her. But Robert, I'm sorry. This must be so hard. I didn't respond. I didn't need sympathy. I just needed to make sure Claire felt the consequences of her actions. The next phase of my plan was public exposure. Claire had a reputation, one built on lies, and I was about to tear it down piece by piece. We were going to host a small dinner party with some of our closest friends and family, a gathering meant to seem casual and fun. But it was going to be anything but. I spent the next few days gathering evidence, screenshots of texts, printed emails, receipts for the hotel where Claire had been sneaking away with Mark. Everything was ready, and when the guests arrived at our home, they would get more than they bargained for. When the dinner was underway and the conversation was flowing, I stood up. All eyes turned to me as I raised my glass. I want to make a toast, I said, my voice carrying over the table. To honesty, to trust, and to the people we let into our lives. I turned to Claire, my eyes cold. Because, Claire, I've been living a lie. I've been married to a woman who thought she could get away with something I would never have imagined. Her eyes widened as I slid the evidence across the table, the damning emails and messages in front of everyone. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire's face went pale, and I could see her trying to find a way out of this, but it was too late. The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, and Claire tried to say something, but no one was listening. The truth was out now. The facade had shattered. The aftermath of it all came quickly. There was no prolonged agony, no drawn-out battle for answers. Claire's world started to crack almost immediately. Her once comfortable life fell apart piece by piece, unraveling in slow motion. Friends I had known for years, people she had socialized with at countless dinner parties, suddenly stopped answering her calls. Invitations were no longer extended. When she tried to join a group chat or meet for coffee, the silences were deafening. And if she did manage to get a response, it was curt, dismissive, a clear indication that people weren't buying her excuses. Her family, who had once adored her, weren't much better. My in-laws, always welcoming and warm to me, now looked at Claire with distrust in their eyes. I saw the way they turned away when she entered the room. Their smiles were no longer genuine, their conversations strained. Even her mother, who had been her biggest ally, couldn't look at her the same way. It wasn't just the guilt that she carried. It was that she knew everyone could see it now, too. The whispers weren't limited to family and friends. At her workplace, the situation only got worse. Claire had always been the office favorite, the charming, ambitious, magnetic woman who kept the place alive. But now, she had become the pariah. The whispers in the hallways, the side-eyed glances in the break room, the way people avoided her in meetings. It was all a reflection of her shattered reputation. And I couldn't help but notice how quickly the change came. One day, she was the darling of the office, and the next, she was an outcast. Every time she walked in, the conversation stopped. It was like her presence hung in the air like a stench. Unavoidable, lingering, suffocating. I didn't feel satisfaction from her humiliation. That wasn't the reason I kept my distance, or the reason I felt the cold resolve settling in my chest. No, I had already taken back what was mine long before the consequences began to unfold for her. It wasn't about watching her life fall apart. It was about reclaiming my own, something I hadn't done in years. It wasn't the same Claire who stood in the doorway now, looking lost as she packed her things. The woman who had once kissed me goodbye with a smile, as if we were heading out for another weekend getaway, was now a stranger, looking small and fragile, her hands shaking as she hastily stuffed her clothes into a suitcase. I stayed still, my arms crossed. She knew better than to expect any more sympathy from me. She had no idea how deep I had fallen into denial over the years, convincing myself that I could fix things, convincing myself that this was just a rough patch. But the truth had slapped me awake. And now, standing there, she was the one with the broken expression, not me. She glanced at me once, hoping for some sign of tenderness, perhaps an outstretched hand, maybe a word of reassurance. But there was nothing. I just stood there, watching her in silence. The silence between us thickened, her uncertainty hanging in the air. She had always been good at pulling on my heartstrings, at making me feel guilty, at convincing me to play the role of the martyr. But now I wasn't going to play that game. I wasn't the man who once excused her behavior out of love or obligation. That man was gone, and in his place was someone who had seen through all of it. There was nothing left of the woman I thought I had loved. She had become an apparition in my eyes, no longer the partner I had built my life with, but a stranger whose lies had pulled me into a dark, toxic place. As I watched her struggle to pack, her eyes flicking to me as though expecting something, I realized something that shook me to my core. She wasn't trying to save us. She was trying to save herself from the wreckage she had created. She faltered for a moment, standing still, as if waiting for me to speak, to beg her to stay. She didn't have the courage to leave without some shred of affirmation, some final reassurance that I still cared. But I wasn't going to indulge her anymore. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, can we just talk?" I didn't flinch. "No," I said flatly, my words more powerful than I had intended. "There's nothing left to say, Claire." The silence returned. She opened her mouth, as if ready to argue, but I cut her off before she could form another word. "Don't come back. Not now, not ever." I watched her face twist, surprise, sadness, even anger flickering in her eyes, but there was no shame. Not a single tear. Not a single apology. Just defiance. She had been caught, but she still didn't seem to understand the depth of what she had done. She walked out without another word. The door clicked shut behind her with a finality that echoed through the empty house. As I stood there in the middle of the room, I realized something. For all the pain I had expected to feel in this moment, anger, regret, bitterness, I felt none of it. It wasn't the catharsis I had imagined. There was no fury or desperation in my chest, no storm of emotions threatening to spill out. Instead, I felt a deep, undeniable sense of relief. The weight of years of suspicion, the weight of being lied to, the weight of loving someone who wasn't capable of loving me back. It all lifted. It was as though I had been holding my breath for so long, and now I could finally exhale. My mind cleared in a way that I hadn't realized was possible. There was nothing left to worry about. No more wondering, no more doubting. The truth had been laid bare, and Claire's departure was the closure I hadn't known I needed. I didn't have to fight anymore. I didn't have to second-guess myself. I was free. For the first time in years, I sat down without a knot in my stomach. The chair I had sat in so many times, waiting for her, wondering what was happening behind my back, felt different now. It was a space just for me, and I didn't feel like the victim anymore. I didn't feel like a man broken by betrayal. I felt like a man who had survived a storm and was finally standing tall in the aftermath. I spent the next few hours cleaning up the mess she had left behind, both physical and emotional. I threw out the remnants of her presence, clothes she'd abandoned, her perfume bottles, things that carried the residue of our time together. I didn't burn them, didn't destroy them in some show of vindictiveness. I simply let them go one by one. It wasn't for revenge. It was for me. It was a strange feeling being alone in the house after so long, but it was also liberating. For the first time in forever, I could finally think without the cloud of Claire's lies hanging over me. The phone calls from her stopped after a few days. Then the text messages dwindled. I knew that this was it. There was no coming back, and I didn't need her. The weeks that followed were filled with a strange sense of serenity. Claire's absence wasn't an emptiness to fill. It was just quiet, a peace I hadn't known I had been missing. It didn't matter what the future held. All that mattered now was that I had finally taken control of my own life. I would never be a fool again. I had reclaimed my power, and that was enough. The silence after Claire's departure was deafening, but it was a silence I welcomed. The house, which had once felt like a cage, suddenly seemed like a place of refuge. I spent days sorting through the mess she left behind, physically and emotionally. It wasn't just her things I was getting rid of. It was all the small pieces of our relationship that no longer served any purpose. I even took down the framed photos of us on vacation, laughing on a beach in Hawaii, or at family gatherings where we smiled and played the part of the perfect couple. Those pictures, those moments, no longer held any meaning. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. What I was, however, was determined. Claire had lied. She had betrayed not just me, but also herself, and the truth was I couldn't let her get away with it. This wasn't about revenge in some grand, dramatic way. It was about making sure she understood that the damage she had caused couldn't be swept under the rug. She wouldn't just walk away and continue with her life unscathed, not while I was still breathing. I'd already been plotting my course for the last few weeks. A series of small, calculated actions, each one designed to destabilize Claire's life, her reputation, her career, her social circle. These weren't acts of uncontrolled rage. They were planned with precision and cold logic. I knew the power of exposing a lie. It wasn't about making her feel sorry for what she had done. It was about forcing her to confront the consequences of her actions. First, I started with her career. Claire had worked hard to climb the corporate ladder, but there was a dark undercurrent to her success. Over the years, I had overheard countless conversations with colleagues that hinted at how much she had used her charm, and at times, her manipulation, to secure promotions. Some of her strategies, though, were far from ethical. I knew there were people who had been overlooked for positions she had unfairly taken, and I was going to make sure they knew they were not alone. One afternoon, I sent an anonymous tip to a journalist who specialized in corporate scandals. I detailed Claire's questionable dealings, the way she had manipulated her position, and how she had used others to climb the ladder. I didn't give the journalist any incriminating evidence. but I made sure the story was compelling enough to investigate. I watched with cold satisfaction as the story made its rounds in the office. It was only a matter of time before Claire's career took a hit. She had worked too hard to keep her secrets hidden, and now the truth was out in the open. I was ensuring that she couldn't ignore the damage she had caused for much longer. Second, I turned my attention to her social life. Claire had always been the life of the party, the one who knew everyone and could charm even the most reserved person into spilling their secrets. But her charming persona was built on lies, lies I had helped her tell. She would say one thing while I knew the truth. One by one, I reached out to the friends who had abandoned her in the wake of her affair. Not directly, of course. I wasn't looking for sympathy. But I made sure the people who were closest to her heard the full story about what she had done. I didn't slander her. I didn't have to. I simply told them the facts. That her affair wasn't a one-time mistake, but a repeated pattern, and I let them draw their own conclusions. It didn't take long for Claire's social circle to fracture completely. Everything I had worked for was now coming to fruition. Claire's once pristine image, built up through years of cultivating her network and presenting the ideal life, was collapsing. Her job was in jeopardy. Her friends were drifting away, and the few people still left by her side were questioning her actions. But there was one more piece I had to place in motion before I could walk away from all of this for good. It was time for the world to see Claire for who she truly was. I had made a few calls to some of the people who had been involved in her affair. I knew who they were. I knew where they worked, where they lived. It didn't take much effort to get them to talk. One of them was particularly forthcoming. A man named Richard, a colleague from the office she'd worked closely with. He wasn't her boss, but he had played a significant part in her ascent. I'd caught wind of their secret meetups over the years, and while Claire had denied them, Richard confirmed everything. I set up a meeting with Richard, and over a few beers, I encouraged him to talk. It didn't take long for him to spill the entire story. It was almost too easy. He told me things about Claire that I didn't know, things I didn't want to know but knew I had to hear. She had manipulated him into helping her advance in her career, even used her charm to cover up their affair when it became public knowledge. It was all there. Lies, betrayal, manipulation. I got Richard to admit it all on tape. I didn't even need to confront Claire with it yet. All I needed was leverage. It was finally time to confront Claire directly. I had given her enough time to fall apart on her own, to experience the unraveling of her life from all angles. Now, it was time for me to lay it out in front of her. I invited her over to the house. She knew that it was going to be different this time. She knew there was no more pretending, no more games. When she walked in, she was visibly shaken, but still trying to maintain control. She was dressed well, as always, but I could see the cracks in her carefully constructed facade. She knew the walls were closing in on her. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "So, Claire," I said, looking her dead in the eye, "you've been busy, haven't you?" She looked confused for a moment. Then her eyes widened. "What do you mean?" I slid a folder across the table. "I've been busy too, gathering everything you've been hiding." I didn't elaborate. I didn't have to. The look on her face said it all. She opened the folder, and her hands trembled slightly as she read the contents. The anonymous tip, the evidence I had gathered, the messages from Richard, all of it laid bare. I watched her face change from defiance to disbelief, then to shame. She tried to speak, but no words came out. She had no defense. There was no way to spin this. The lies had caught up with her, and now everyone knew the truth. "I didn't want to do this," I said calmly, "but you left me no choice. This isn't about me getting revenge. It's about you facing the reality of what you've done. You hurt a lot of people, Claire, and now it's time for you to deal with the consequences." The final days after our confrontation were a blur. Claire's life continued to fall apart in ways that I couldn't have predicted. Her career, which had once seemed so solid, was now in shambles. The people she had once counted as her closest friends turned their backs on her. Her carefully crafted persona, the one that made her a star in both her professional and social life, was now a ghost, a thing of the past. But none of it felt like satisfaction for me. It was justice, and it was deserved. I didn't care if she tried to reach out again. I didn't care if she begged for forgiveness or promised to change. The truth had been exposed, and I was no longer the man who had been held captive by her lies. I was free. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding my own life. I took long walks, revisited old hobbies, and reconnected with old friends. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. And as Claire continued to spiral, I realized that her story wasn't mine to follow anymore. Her actions no longer had the power to define my future. I was free to live on my own terms. I learned a lot from all of this. Trust is something that should never be taken lightly. It's not about vengeance or bitterness, but about taking back what is rightfully yours. Claire had her secrets, but I had my peace. And in the end, that was all I ever needed. There are always two sides to every story. But the truth always comes out. And when it does, it can either tear you down or set you free. For me, it did both. But what mattered was that in the end, I chose to walk away and live on my own terms. Because at the end of the day, no one should ever let another person's betrayal define them. And now I knew better.